Welcome to this Killik Explains finance video. This week, an important topic, a slightly depressing topic that a lot of people don't want to think about, but one we must address. How to prepare for the cost of care. Now, the context for this is what? Well, basically, care costs are one of the key personal milestones that most people would love to avoid, but actually in reality, fewer and fewer of us will. Explain why in a moment. So, although there are plenty of other milestones that we need an investment strategy to cover, funding care is one that more and more of us need to pay attention to. Now, let's deal with some myths. I won't need care. Clearly, no one wants to end up in a situation where they need care. But here are the demographic realities, if you like. This is Age UK, a recent comprehensive survey. On average, a woman aged 65 in England can expect to live another 21 years and a man 19. That is, in a sense, good news. So is this. The number of people aged 85 plus in England has risen by a third in 10 years and will double over the next 10. So we are living longer. We have longer retirements, if you like, but not at full health. Up to 50% currently of the over 85s are defined as frail. All right. Disability-free life expectancy has actually fallen since peaking around 2010-2012, according to Age UK, and that's why they conclude that more of us are spending more time in later life with social care needs. So although none of us want that, that is potentially the reality. Now, the bottom line. According to the Money Advice Service, this is where things get a little bit scary. This is how much it all costs. Now, 40,000 on the left is the number that represents the average cost of a nursing care home per year in the UK. Think that's a lot, try finding a space in a decent care home in the southeast of England or London, and that is arguably 50% lower than the true number. £50,000, now this varies according to who you ask, according to the government, could be the cost of 24-hour at-home care. So people are thinking, well, I won't go into a home for any sorts of reasons because I'll do it myself. That can get pretty expensive when you need, let's say, 2 people working around the clock to help. And 5.1% is a scary number because that's the rise annually in average nursing home costs over the past 21 years, or 20 years to be precise. And that, in most of those years, is well above the rate of underlying inflation. So it's an expensive business. Now, to just bring that home, let's take a look at care costs, just one of those scenarios, if you like, and a snapshot. So this is using our own, that's Killik & Go's cost of care report with data provided by the PSSRU. So a typical care resident stays around 1.5 years. That's just residential care without nursing at an average cost of around £60,000. Don't forget, all of these numbers have got to come out of taxed income, if you're trying to do it that way. A typical nursing home resident stays around 2.3 years, that's with nursing care. They tend to be more expensive because they provide nursing care at an average cost of £70,000. Now, those are quite big numbers, but that's not the full picture. For the longest lived quartile, if you like, a typical nursing home stay can be more like 3.5 years, bringing the cost up to around £115,000, and a typical residential stay, 4.5 years, at a cost of around £130,000. Big numbers, all right? Now, there'll be people out there thinking, it's fine, I'll rely on the state. But actually, that's not a good idea. Who pays? In a lot of cases, in the home, for example, that my father's in at the moment, 50% of cases, it is the residents who pay, and usually, slightly controversially, at a higher rate than the equivalent local authority. I'll leave that to one side. Now, who pays? The NHS, on health grounds, will step in 2 sets of circumstances. There is a thing called NHS funded nursing care, FNC care, but that only covers, if you qualify, a lot of people do, £155 per week, all right? And that, you can quickly see from looking at the previous data, isn't the full bill. Now, under certain conditions, you can actually get full 100% cover in effect for the care costs that you need. It's called continuing healthcare funding, but the qualifying criteria are really, really strict, and if anything, getting more strict. And it needs sign-off from a GP, social services, and so on. So an awful lot of people don't qualify bottom left. Now you might be thinking, okay, can I get some sort of grant or support from a local authority if I don't qualify on the left, bottom left? The answer is yes, but it's means tested and you need to have relatively low levels of assets to qualify. So there is financial support available on a means tested basis, but basically, to cut some detail down, your savings need to have dwindled down to £23,250 before you'll qualify. Your home may be excluded. Now, I won't go through all the circumstances, but for example, if your spouse is still alive and they occupy your main family home, it's kind of ring-fenced. It can't be used for your care costs in that set of circumstances. And basically the amount they contribute is fixed by them. So a lot of people think, great, once I qualify on the right, the council will pay for it all. Not necessarily. They might decide they only want to pay a certain amount towards your care fees. You're in a home that costs more than that, or your round-the-clock care costs more than that, at which point they step back and say, well, over to you. So, translation, an awful lot of us are going to be paying for an awful lot more of our care in the future. Now, what about the care cap? Some people are thinking, wasn't there some rumour from the government that they'd introduce a care cap, so you'd only ever pay a certain amount? Well, yes, but unfortunately, two problems. One, it's currently somewhat up in the air after Theresa May raised the issue and nearly lost an election as a result of it. So from April 2020, there is a proposal out there which is currently being debated. The amount that you pay for care should be capped at £72,000. But there's a key word here, care, which I'll come back to in just a moment. That's still high, but at least it's lower than some of the numbers I threw at you just a moment ago. The threshold for means testing will rise as well to include your main home, but they're going to bump up the number. Now the problem is, this is all up in the air, but we do have some pointers. So let's assume similar proposals are eventually adopted to the original ones sent out a few years ago. Basically, you will need to be assessed as having very high needs to meet this definition of care by the local authorities. So again, it's back to the local authorities to decide. Okay, they will determine the maximum funded care rate. So they will decide what rate of care costs can contribute towards that 72,000 ceiling. And it may not be the rate you're actually paying is the important point. You will remain responsible for food and lodging. So this is just a cap on care costs. And estimates therefore suggest that as low as 1 in 8 people will ever actually be able to use the cap, even if implemented in its current form, which isn't certain. Now, paying for care, given that an awful lot of us will have to. So many of us will need to pay for care, we've established that. We'll want choice. Now some people will be thinking, well, I'll just go for the cheapest option. Not a great idea, because basically cheap homes, for example, I'm afraid, can be cheap for a reason. You pay to some extent for what you get. And therefore, what people will need to do is plan. So think about ways to maximise the income you're generating from your assets, all right, as you reach the point where you may need long-term care, all right, and make sure you're claiming all entitlements. You need to be on the ball with this stuff. So, for example, this is just one, there is a thing called the attendance allowance for the over 65s. That's being replaced by a thing called the PIP for those people who are less than 65, and there is a disability living allowance, sort of an equivalent for very young people. But you need to be on the ball because the rules change all the time. Make sure you're getting what you're entitled to from the state. And in terms of assets, people will need a plan that basically sees them through that long-term care stage. So that could involve supplementing income with a rundown of investment capital, for example. And it will mean that people who potentially have got a home as their main and only asset will need to think about ways they can potentially use it to pay for care, whether that's downsizing with the kind of stress and trauma that moving house can cause, equity release, which can be okay but can also be quite expensive if you don't go for the right type of scheme, and or an outright sale, I suppose, if you've moved lock, stock and barrel into, say, a long-term nursing care home. So all of that needs to be thought about. And basically, if I could give sort of one piece of advice in this video from personal experience, don't think about two things. One is giving assets away to kind of avoid long-term care costs, and the other is what I call letting the roof fall in. So giving assets away, people often think, well, what I'll do, because it's inheritance tax effective, I guess this is where they fall over, to give assets away. There's a potentially exempt transfer rule, for example, which I cover in other videos. There are other regular gifts rules, so you can basically reduce your death estate so you pay less inheritance tax on it ultimately, or those you leave behind do, your executors and so on. That doesn't work so well for care fees. Here, I think all the deprivation of assets rules kicks in, and this is basically designed to stop people thinking, crikey, if I don't give assets away, they could be seized for long-term care costs, and therefore what I'll do is give them away quickly. Well, the problem with that, apart from the fact it may leave you with not enough money to pay for the care home you want, for example, the other problem with that is the council reserve the right to come and look at your motivation, look at whether it was reasonably foreseeable you'd need care at the time, and basically go back and say, in spite of the fact you tried to give assets away, we are going to include them in that means test. So do be careful. The rules on giving assets away vary according to what it is you are trying to achieve. Now, don't wait till the roof collapses. This is my main piece of advice and takeaway. Whilst all of us want to not have to think about things like long-term care, the reality is we should. It makes life a little bit straightforward. So, planning. What sort of care do you think you might want, even if you're not in that position yet? Is your home appropriate, for long-term care? What modifications could be needed needed, how long will they take? To what extent will social services cover some of that bill? How willing and able are family members to help out with long-term care? If they're not physically located on the same continent, that could be a problem. And is there a care home nearby, if you're going to go down that route, that you don't mind the look of and that has space? And people often find something they like and then find they can't get into it. All right, and finally, look at what you can afford realistically well in advance. Being prepared is a case of organising your finances. So get investment summaries in place. Make sure you've got those. Make sure you've got account details. Make sure you know account passwords and so on in case somebody else, come to that as the last point, needs to take over for you. And key correspondence is ready and clear, relating to tax, for example. And then prepare key documents. Now, part of the reason I mentioned power of attorney here, I mentioned it in other videos, is that actually, increasingly, some care homes, for example, won't accept new residents unless they see evidence that there is a power of attorney in place. So you may need one in that circumstance. They're also incredibly useful because it enables somebody else, if you, for example, are in a care home, to look after health and welfare decisions and finance and property decisions, probably more importantly, without necessarily you being directly involved. Won't go through the process here, cover that in other videos. Wills, vitally important. If you haven't got one, get one in place as soon as possible. I'd say that to anyone aged about 40 or over these days. And it's worth reviewing because you may have written one 20 years ago, but actually has the person you nominated as executor changed in terms of would you prefer someone else to do the job, and are you still happy with the way your assets are going to be distributed on death? All right, tricky topics. Not everyone wants to have to think about these kind of things, but by planning in advance, you do make life easier both for yourself and potentially other people too. Okay, big topic. editor@killik.com with any questions. And if you'd like to watch those videos on things like power of attorney, wills, and so on, please go to killik.com/learn.